Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm New York State Attorney General Eric Schneiderman, and I am joined today by some of our leading advocates for reform, people who fight every day for a more fair, more transparent, and more effective government. With me today are Josh Mumm of Common Cause, Kathy Smith of the League of Women Voters, and Becky LaLonde of the Interfaith Alliance of Rochester. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here because while we know that corruption in New York State is nothing new, that even in our state's long history, the events of this year stand out. To be clear, I do not think that corruption now is worse than it's ever been in the state government, but more of it is now being exposed by the work of prosecutors, by journalists, and I'm proud to say by the work of the Office of the New York State Attorney General. While the overwhelming majority of public servants in state and local governments in New York and across the country are good folks who want to do right by the people who elect them, ladies and gentlemen, this year, with the leaders of both houses of the legislature being indicted for corruption in a single session, makes the need for reform in Albany shockingly clear. On May 13th, the governor and the new legislative leaders met to discuss their priorities for the end of the legislative session. Amazingly, ethics reform and campaign finance reform did not even make the cut. They were not even on Albany's agenda. Well, we are here today to deliver the message, and we will deliver it as often as we have to and in any way we can, that ethics and campaign finance reform must be back on the agenda for the people of the state of New York. They are the agenda. Concern about corruption in government goes far beyond good government groups or editorial boards. A new poll out last week showed that more than 90% of New Yorkers say corruption is a serious problem. That's an extraordinary number. For years, each new scandal has brought a new wave of outrage and then followed a familiar pattern. Scandal, followed by outrage, followed by prosecution, then reforms that did not solve the problem, followed by another scandal and another rounds of reforms that tinker at the margins. Well, that's not good enough. It's not good enough for me. It's not good enough for the advocates standing with me and other advocacy groups that have united across the state, and it's damn sure not good enough for the people of the state of New York. That is why I've introduced last week the End New York Corruption Now Act, a comprehensive ethics package that reformers, good government groups, activists, and the people of New York State demand. The reform legislation that we've introduced has three main goals. First, to end the pernicious effect of money in both politics and government. Second, to ensure that every act of corruption is met with a swift and serious response. And third, to encourage more honorable people to enter public service. No one can say that the reforms in this legislation are radical or partisan. Many of the proposals have been advanced and examined for years. Many of them have in fact been introduced by members of both the Senate and the Assembly. And I note that some of the reforms here have been passed years in a row by the Assembly on some occasions. But we have to move past one House bills, and we have to have all the leaders in Albany united behind comprehensive reform. My point is very simple. The legislature and the governor have all the information and time they need to make all the changes proposed in this bill before the end of this year's session. This bill is more comprehensive, its reforms are more fundamental, but it addresses issues that we are all familiar with. Here's what we're proposing. This reform legislation will end outside employment for lawmakers. It will ban per diem payments and dramatically tighten campaign contribution limits. If you work for the people of New York, they should be your only clients. In return for this, legislators should be paid like the full-time professionals that they are. Accordingly, we're calling for a substantial salary increase, which would be the first pay raise the legislature has gotten since 1998. And let's extend legislative terms from 2 years to 4 years. This will give lawmakers time to focus on governing instead of politics. On the whole, we think this is all very doable. We tighten up the system. In return for that, the legislature gets treated like a full-time legislature. We also through this legislation will cut down on Albany's pay-to-play culture by dramatically lowering New York's political contribution limits, which were among the highest in the nation, and will further limit contributions from lobbyists and companies that do business with the state, even beyond the regular reduction in contribution limits we're proposing. There are rules like this about lobbyists and companies and individuals with business before the state in other jurisdictions. There are rules like this in New York City. No reason we should not provide the same protections in Albany. And speaking of New York City, the city has already demonstrated that a voluntary public financing system can work, and that robust public financing for state elections would allow good, honorable people of modest means to compete for office. It's clear from the records in New York City and in other states that have public financing that it produces more contested elections and enables people who otherwise couldn't afford to compete to run and win. Of course, even with these reforms, there will always be some public officials that break the law, and those who break the law will see swift and serious consequences. Our legislation will ensure that. We can strengthen enforcement by giving the Office of the Attorney General the clear authority to investigate public corruption whenever it occurs. I'm very proud of the fact that my office, over the past 4 years, through an innovative and unprecedented agreement with State Controller Tom DiNapoli, has been able to begin investigating public corruption at a level the Attorney General's office never has. We have brought more than 70 cases against corrupt individuals and their cronies all across the state. But the state's top law enforcement agency should have the right to investigate corruption wherever it occurs, and that's what this legislation would guarantee. Our reform legislation also provides very, very important tools for all state prosecutors to make it easier to investigate and prosecute corruption. We include stricter laws around self-dealing for the benefit of a legislator or family member, bribery, and pension forfeiture, which will help stop some of Albany's most egregious abuses. Again, these are reforms that have been called for in the past. This is not new territory. It's just a more comprehensive approach, and given the circumstances, that is exactly what the public is demanding. So, my friends, at the end of the day, there are only two paths forward: more investigations, more indictments, and the further erosion of public confidence in our government, or comprehensive, transformational reform that will prevent corruption in the first place. I'm very pleased that our legislation has already been introduced in the New York State Assembly. I only announced this bill on Wednesday, already introduced in the Assembly, and has a very senior sponsor, Assemblyman Joe Lenthal, the chair of the Codes Committee, and other co-sponsors signing on every day. We need to get the other parts of the government to agree to this, but we're confident that there is time to move forward, and that the vision of comprehensive reform is something that everyone should speak up for and affirm their commitment to right now, and make it clear that it is on the agenda for the rest of the session. Some of us here standing today, and some of the people I've worked with for years on reform issues, have been fighting for decades. Some of us have gotten very gray in the process. But I do believe, after working on this for decades, that this year we're in a unique position. We've never had the level of public support for comprehensive reform we have right now. It is being demanded by average New Yorkers all across our state. I'm done with half measures. The people of New York are done too. Bold change, real transformational change is possible, and it's what we need. So I thank the reformers who are standing here with me today and who have stood with me in New York City and Long Island and other places where I'm speaking up about the need for reform. This is a time for all reformers, both in and out of government, to raise their voices so we can get this done. Thank you very much. And now we're going to hear from Josh Mumm, one of our strongest allies in this reform battle. Have always been the folks from Common Cause, and he's here to add his voice to the cry for reform today. Josh.
Thank you very much. Morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Common Cause members across the state, we are grateful that New York State Attorney General understands that the depth of corruption in New York State politics demands a response that is equally broad in its scope and bold enough to address the issues head on. It's past time to turn around the vicious cycle of corruption, with 91% of New Yorkers in a recent poll saying that corruption in our government is a serious problem. These reforms offer a clear path to begin restoring the public's faith in our government. Now, we know that corruption doesn't just affect Albany. Indeed, it affects all corners of our state. And Common Cause New York has been an advocate for every single piece of reform that's in this bill. We believe in creating a full-time legislature, in banning outside income, and paying our legislators a professional salary. To put it simply, the public's business should be the only business of our elected officials. In 2015, when our schools and communities are struggling, it is in the public's interest that their elected officials should focus on governing rather than raising money. And that is why we believe that 4-year terms, along with a system of public financing for election campaigns, are critical pieces of this reform package. The constant need to raise election and re-election funds from the day officials take office until their terms end not only bends the ear of our state representatives to those who can write large checks, but it takes the focus off debating and passing legislation and engaging and listening to their constituents. Make no mistake about it, privately funded elections allow for corruption to flourish. And one way that I'll quickly talk about, one way of writing large donations is what's called the LLC loophole. And we are pleased that this bill addresses this egregious abuse of our campaign finance laws. Limited liability companies need to be treated like any other corporation, and it is absurd that our state allows millions of dollars each year to be donated by a single company through their LLCs. After the arrest of 60 state legislators in the past 4 years, this package of reforms sets a course for where we need to be heading as a state. New Yorkers are sick and tired of half-measure reforms like those that were negotiated in this year's state budget. Attorney General Eric Schneiderman has done all New York State residents a great service with this package by keeping the reform dialogue going. And Common Cause New York looks forward to working for the passage of these common sense and long overdue measures to achieve meaningful and effective ethics, oversight, and enforcement.
Thank you. And now I'm very pleased that we're joined today by Kathy Smith of the League of Women Voters.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. With corruption charges pending against the leaders of both our houses of the legislative chamber, public confidence in our elected officials may be at the lowest point after more than a decade of dozens of officials being charged because of ethical problems. Most elected officials are honorable public servants. In the Rochester metro area, we have many assembly members and New York state senators who represent us well and have done so for years. But the League of Women Voters of New York has for decades lobbied for numerous reforms that involve how money is raised and how money is spent from Albany. We strongly support the proposals of the Attorney General and look forward to this legislation being passed this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you. And now we're going to hear from Becky Elwell of the Interfaith Alliance of Rochester.
The Interfaith Alliance of Rochester proudly supports the work that Attorney General Eric Schneiderman is doing on ethics reform. The proposed legislation in New York Corruption Now Act enumerates many steps in the right direction. Reducing the number of corrupt legislators can only improve the trust of our people for our legislators. The ethics reform of campaign finance law will allow more New York citizens to have input into the system. We applaud the work to lower campaign contributions by individuals and corporations. As others have said, piecemeal reforms are not enough to make real steps in stopping the culture of corruption. The proposed reform to the legislature go a long way in correcting the criminal culture. Criminal law reform and campaign finance reforms are a package that answers Interfaith Alliance of Rochester's concerns of piecemeal approach towards these problems of ethics. The Interfaith Alliance of Rochester will support and work for this comprehensive effort to end Corruption Now Act. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and ladies and gentlemen. I think that the cause is clear, the demand is clear, and I've been working on these issues for a long time. Before I was even in elective office, I was on the board of another reform group, Citizen Action of New York, for years, working on campaign finance reform and corruption issues. This has been growing for some time, but believe me when I tell you that in my lifetime, there has never been the public outcry for comprehensive reform we see this year. This is a moment when anyone who is a reformer, who wants to style themselves as a reformer in Albany, must take action. So with that, I will let you take questions, and Matt will
start on the topic of the bill. You could identify yourself.
Sure. Todd Clausen, Democrat in front. You mentioned increasing the legislators' pay. Upstate in particular, many people, whether you're living in poverty or you're middle class, you're dealing with wages that haven't been growing for several years. How do you justify to them that something like this will actually get approved?
Well, the legislature has not had a pay raise since 1998, and we have a legislative pay raise commission already in existence, so they're considering a pay raise anyway. I think it's important to understand that this pay raise is contingent on the legislature agreeing to all these other provisions, which would essentially seal off anyone in the legislature from any outside income of any kind, or any outside earned income. It would end the phenomenon where we have lawyers working for law firms who may have major clients of the firms who do business with the state, but if the lawyer's not billing time to that client, it's not even doesn't even have to be disclosed. It would eliminate the problems of money in campaigns and really provide for a clean system all the way around. In return for that, I think it's important to recognize that we want the best people we can have in the legislature, and that to a certain extent, you get what you pay for. They are paid. Our members of the New York State Legislature should work full time. It is a full time job if you're doing it right, and they are paid significantly less than, for example, members of the New York City Council, which is, in my view, outrageous. So we just set parameters for what the raise should be, but I think it's something that if you take it in the context of the bill as a whole, this is really profound change. We're asking people in Albany to do some stuff that is dramatic, is comprehensive, and we think it's important to also send the message that we are trying to attract the best people to government. We want legislators to be respected. We don't want people to believe that everyone is on the take, which unfortunately is the attitude too many people have now, and we think a pay raise is a part of that.
With so many provisions, how do you expect it to get passed? I mean, even with the Women's Equality Act, it's taken a while for that portions of that to get through.
You should not confuse the total lack of political will on some issues for complexity and a lack of time. The last few weeks in a legislative session in Albany, it's like dog years. It's an incredibly long period of time. Very complex pieces of legislation get written, rewritten, negotiated all the time. It's really too easy to say we don't have time. Women's Equality Act is a great example. There's one provision they can't agree on. It's not because there's not enough time. It's just because they don't want to do it. Perfect example. Everything in this bill can be done. There's time to do it. What we lack is the political will.
Why not allocate from general? Why not eliminate one-house bills? You said spend a lot of time on those, it's in the base. Why not start with that?
Well, we have a bicameral legislature under our Constitution. So the idea is that you have two houses that introduce bills and then negotiate reform. When I said going beyond one-house bills, I meant the phenomenon that sometimes one house will pass legislation, the other will pass legislation that's similar, but they won't negotiate so that it becomes a law. We want to see this done in both houses of the legislature, and We only introduced it last Wednesday. It's picked up a lot of support already in the Assembly, and now we're looking to the Senate and the executive for leadership.
Anything else? Any other topics? If you have.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Cody Combs, 13 Ram ABC.
I'm sorry.
Cody
Oh.
Combs, 13 Ram. As you know, we had a suspect die in police custody yesterday, taser, and then passed away shortly thereafter. In the grand scheme of things, some are calling for independent prosecutors such as yourself and your office to investigate these sort of things. Is that something you would consider? Is that something you would favor?
This is obviously a tragic circumstance, and my heart goes out to the family. I gather that there has been a swift response from both the police department and from the mayor here, and there is an investigation underway. I think that there are several proposals now on the table in the state legislature dealing with the tragic circumstances when a police officer's contact with a civilian results in the death of the civilian, and one of those proposals, I think, probably will be enacted into law before the end of the session, just to provide an extra layer of public confidence that there is independence in those investigations. But which one is going to go as of right now, I hesitate to predict.
Jennifer Mobilia with News 10 NBC. I'd like to talk to you about your proposed zombie home legislation. The governor recently announced he struck a best practices agreement with banks, but there's no legislation. Do you think it goes far enough?
Well, we're still pushing for the legislation. It's sponsored in the Senate by Senator Klein and the Assembly by Assemblymember Weinstein, has tremendous bipartisan support. Zombie homes are a burden on every local government in the state. If you want to get a mayor or county executive or town supervisor agitated, talk to them about the plague of abandoned properties that bring down property values, that are havens for crime and vandalism. We have to solve the problem of abandoned homes where the bank hasn't completed foreclosure and no one takes responsibility for the property. The Department of Financial Services negotiated a voluntary agreement with some banks, which is great. If any banks maintain properties, that's a good thing, but it has no enforcement provisions. It provides no resources to local governments to deal with the problem, and it does not do anything about expediting foreclosure proceedings in these circumstances. New York has the slowest foreclosure proceedings in the country, and if a home is abandoned and we know the bank's eventually going to get title to it, there's no reason we can't move that process along so it can get back on the market and we can get a family in there and revive the neighborhoods that are victims of the collapse of the housing market. If you saved your home and managed to pay off your mortgage even with the crash of the economy in 2008, but you are on a street with 2 or 3 abandoned properties, you are also a victim of the crash. We've got to solve the problem of abandoned properties, and the legislation that we're pushing now that I've introduced, I think has an excellent chance to become law over the course of the next couple of weeks.
Anything else? Last one.
How about the overall use of tasers? Is that something you can be investigating or anything you can be investigating?
There are different policies regarding tasers in different parts of the state. I think it's something that has been looked at. It is being looked at nationally. These circumstances are certainly very unusual, but it's a tragedy, and I don't want to comment further on the specific case.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.